Morena koutou. We'll make a start for the day. We're slightly early, but seeing everyone who needs to be in the room is in the room, and we're live streamed, and people can watch this afterwards if they want. We will make a start for the day. We start with the Queenstown Country Club team. So Mr. Minhinnick, over to you and your team. And thank you for the legal submissions, and we've had a read through those.
Fantastic.
So you don't need to read them, but more highlights, etc.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Daniel Minhinnick, tōku ingoa. In terms of introductions for the Queenstown Country Club team, so to my left is Mr. Farrell, the planning expert for the Country Club. And then I have Mr. Bentley and then Ms. Rennie. And so you should also have statements of evidence from those witnesses, as well as some brief hearing statements that we've provided, which are intended to update the panel on things that have arisen since their evidence in chief was circulated. In terms of my legal submissions, I won't read those out. I'll just focus on the key points. Essentially, the Country Club is supportive of the overall intent of the variation. Its submission effectively focuses on the Queenstown Country Club site, and in particular the setback or building restriction area that applies to the frontage of the Country Club site, adjoining Ladies Mile. Under the variation as proposed, there was a 75-metre setback proposed. That, from the Country Club's perspective, was too large, and there wasn't a basis for that. And so the focus of the evidence for the Country Club has been on a smaller setback being appropriate, and happily, through the hearing version of the Council's provisions, that has been reflected in the Council's version as well. The matters of disagreement between the Country Club and the Council are now reasonably limited. You'll see attached to Mr. Farrell's summary statement is a set of marked up provisions, and so those reflect markups to the Council's hearing version. There essentially haven't been any changes to the Council's provisions between the original hearings version and the one from earlier this week. And so those show and mark up the additional changes sought. And so Mr. Farrell in particular will take you through those in short order. The other preliminary point I wish to make is that there aren't essentially any other submitters who have a direct interest professed through their submissions or evidence in this particular issue. It's essentially been one between the Country Club and the Council. The closest has been some comments in the evidence of Mr. Blakely, and I think Mr. Farrell will briefly touch on that when he presents. So in terms of my submissions, perhaps if I move through to section 3 of my submissions, essentially this 75-metre setback as originally proposed was an artefact from the resource consent granted for the development of the Country Club back in 2016 under the special housing legislation. At that time, and you would have seen from the evidence of the witnesses for the Country Club, Ladies Mile was quite a different environment to what is contemplated by this change. And so essentially it was seen as appropriate at that time, but things change, and so as of today, looking ahead as far as what is most appropriate for Ladies Mile, the evidence for the Country Club is very strongly that a 75-metre setback is no longer appropriate. And so the evidence originally focused on a 25-metre setback, but certainly through the subsequent witness conferencing, there is a question as to even whether a 25-metre setback is appropriate. And so there are different views, I think, between the landscape architects versus the urban design experts on those issues, and certainly Mr. Bentley and Ms. Rennie will be able to speak to you as far as their perspectives on that issue.
Just one quick question from me on that is your submission was very clear for the 25. Just clarity of scope to go any closer. I mean, your submission was very short, and it is about the setback, but it was just something that I was minded about was scope to sort of bring it in closer. So just something to ponder.
Certainly, and as a preliminary comment on that, you'll see the provisions that we've put forward do still seek a 25-metre setback. It is a question of what the appropriate activity status is as far as development within that 25-metre setback. While the Country Club's submission was quite focused as far as the relief that it has sought, there's obviously a wide range of different submissions, many of which are quite broad as far as their approach to the Ladies Mile area as a whole. And so I'm sure that when the panel is considering those broader matters, the question of the appropriate setback is one that goes to the design treatment of Ladies Mile in a general sense as well. And so certainly in terms of the submissions, the Country Club submission itself is reasonably limited from a scope perspective, but there are certainly other submissions that are far broader from that perspective.
Thank you.
The other aspect as far as the historic nature of the setback at 3.4 is that even though a 75-metre setback was considered appropriate at that time, it was certainly not seen as being the permanent solution. And so this variation is essentially the next step in the evolution of that broader environment. Moving through to 3.9 of my submissions do outline the evidence for the Country Club that outlines the benefits of a reduced setback and how those align with the overall vision for the structure plan area. And when it comes to the provisions that Mr. Farrell can take you through, there are then parameters around what the assessment criteria should be for any development within that 25-metre setback area to ensure that some of those landscape and urban design considerations that have come through the evidence and also the joint witness statements are appropriately considered if there is any proposal to build within that setback area. Moving forward to section 4 of my submissions, just as far as the overall suite of provisions. So Mr. Farrell, in the appendix to his evidence, had set out some provisions for the Country Club site. There was a different approach that he took to what was in the plan changes originally contemplated, in particular through controlled activity status. Mr. Brown, in his rebuttal evidence, provided an updated set of provisions. The Country Club is, while Mr. Farrell's appendix is essentially considered appropriate, the Country Club is happy to live with Mr. Brown's updated provisions, subject to these more subtle changes that Mr. Farrell will be able to take you through. And those go to the setbacks, the relevant heights, and the activity statuses are essentially the key considerations that he will take you through. Very happy to take any questions, but those were probably the key points that I wish to make, given that the submissions have been pre-circulated.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minhinnick. Yes, Ian.
I just want to clarify your understanding of the extent to which the Country Club site has been included within the plan change area. And so do you have available to you the council's plan provisions and the suite of zone plans, structure plans, etc.?
Yes, I will.
And then just when you find that, let me know what version of them you're looking at so I can make sure I'm looking at them too. What's that one?
Okay.
Is that the master one that was circulated the other day? Okay.
The 8 December version?
That's fine. So can you just scroll through, and the first plan I want to talk to you about is on page, I think it's 37. It's the Ladies Mile Structure Plan general.
Yes.
You got that?
Yes.
So what I can see with what I understand to be your client's land is the northernmost strip, which effectively accounts for the setback included in the
Yes.
zone. That's the red line.
Yes.
I'd like you just to keep in your mind the northeastern corner of the village site, and immediately north of that there's a little black circle denoting an intersection.
Yes. The one that's
So-
circled.
Yes. So what I read on that map is a strip of frontage along the site extending to effectively almost the centre line of the road. Is that what you see?
Yes.
Then can you turn to the building heights plan? And that has what looks like the same red line denoting the zone.
Yes.
Then scroll past the sections and we get to the zoning plan. And when I look at the zoning plan, what looks like a building restriction line seems to bend 90 degrees and come southwards. And I don't see, when I look at the red zoning lines, that little recessed gap down the road. And so I'm trying to understand what one is correct and which one is there an incorrectness, and does the building restriction double dip an existing restriction that's a different method somewhere else, or do we have a slight mismatch at that corner of your client's site?
Certainly, and that's probably a question for Mr. Farrell in particular, but my understanding is more aligned to those
Those red
pages
lines.
37 and 38
Okay.
as far as the red lines.
Okay, you'll appreciate, you're the submitter for this site, you're the authority on what you think the plan change does, and I didn't quite understand where that came from. But Mr. Farrell maybe can address it when we come to him later if you're not sure.
Certainly.
So, but if we found there was a contradiction, it's your view that the red lines shown on the other plans define the scope of what we can look at changing through this exercise, or is there a basis for us to go beyond the red lines, and if so, what? And I'm asking because we have other submitters who are outside of the identified line who would like to be in it, and I'm keen to understand what you think is in or out and why.
Certainly. Because one aspect that goes beyond the red line is the lower density suburban residential zone for the QCC site as a whole. And so that is another aspect covered in the variation as I understand it. So it's, there is certainly a mismatch in terms of the extent to which that building restriction applies, and so that is a question for the experts as far as what the appropriate outcome is. From a scope perspective, it is, the zoning does apply to the balance of the QCC site as well, and so I don't think it's so much a scope question as a merits question.
Well, hold on, how can that be? The council's giving us a case that says we're only looking at rezoning land from the status quo within its identified red area. It's not a rezone anything else that's convenient too. So if it's outside of the red zone area, is it still in the plan change? And I think there's an argument that yes. But we need to be crystal clear on in what circumstances the red line describes what the zone is, for the sake of other submitters who might like to know how we decide consistently what's in or out. So your view is, regardless of the red line, there are other provisions that have been notified that create a particular inclusion for the site?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, so in that respect, the red line isn't necessarily as important for your client's land because of those other notified provisions as it might be for that
I think that's fair, yes.
Okay, very good, thanks.
Julie, nothing? Hoani?
No, I'm good.
Judith? No. Nothing from me, thank you, Mr. Minhinnock. That was very clear, and with the evidence and how things have moved, it reflects that as well.
Certainly.
So, yes, we'll have questions for the experts, but during that, of course, if there are, that may bounce to you as well.
Absolutely. So the first witness is Mr. Bentley, and so you should have a brief hearing statement from him that he will take you through now.
Lovely. Thank you, Mr. Bentley.
Good morning. So I'm a landscape architect at Boffin-Miskell, and I provided landscape evidence in chief dated the 20th of October 2023.
Perfect. You can skip straight to
Great.
let me see. 1 point. What about 1.7? Just the highlights.
The highlights.
We don't need the background.
No,
part.
of course, of course.
We've read all the statements,
Yes,
etc.
okay. So in terms of the highlights, I have reviewed the updated provisions presented by Mr. Brown at the hearing, and I'm in broad agreement with those that relate to the Queenstown Country Club site. Particularly these concern rules within Chapter 7, which is the lower density suburban residential part of the PDP. In particular, I broadly support those rules outlined in Rule 7.5, particularly regarding building height, standard of 6 metres. But I also comment on the potential for further increase in building height at paragraph 1.12 below. Maximum number of residential units within the 120 metres of the boundary of State Highway 6 is 42, with a maximum floor area of 310. And an information requirement requiring applications for resource consent to contain a design statement describing how the proposed building location and appearance achieves the matters of discretion and is commensurate with the existing buildings within Queenstown Country Club. Now, for the reasons given by Ms. Rennie, which she will talk to later, I agree that the approved development of the development plan in relation to that specific resource consent is no longer required. So I consider that these plan provisions will enable a high-quality development outcome that will continue to protect views, the northern part of the Remarkables particularly, and the broader views towards Peninsula Hill and Cecil Peak, provide a level of spaciousness and maintain a consistent landscape character of the State Highway 6 Ladies Mile corridor. In my view, concerns around density, scale, form and location of buildings that Mr. Skelton raises in his evidence as a concern in his rebuttal evidence concerning primarily the building restriction area, where they may affect a sense of openness and views to the wider outstanding natural landscape, will be addressed through the amended rules in Chapter 7, which Mr. Farrell will lead you through. As stated previously at this hearing, this district is blessed with 97% of it being recognised as an outstanding natural landscape. All built form in the district retains a sense of place due to, in part, by the prominence of the surrounding mountain backdrop. To Pūtahi, Ladies Mile is the same. The proposed plan provisions will enable the maintenance of landscape principles, including the integrity of the adjacent outstanding natural landscapes, the Roche Mountainais of Slope Hill, and the upper terrace setting contained by the lower river terraces of the Kaurau and Shotover rivers, including Lake Hayes to the east. Views towards the wider landscape will still be evident, although truncated in some areas. So, through the course of these proceedings, I've also considered other aspects that have come to light since the hearings commenced. So I understand that the urban designers have undertaken discussions on a further reduction of the building restriction area from 25 metres, notably around the commercial node of State Highway 6 and Howards Drive. I also understand that building heights of 8 metres also be contemplated. I would generally support a further reduction in the building restriction area, as well as contemplation of the setback to be either 18 or 20 metres as set out in the summary evidence of Ms. Rennie, and other matters including slight height increases and a greater level of density. However, I consider that this needs to be supported by an appropriate policy framework, ensuring that landscape values are appropriately managed. The reduced size of the building restriction area, for example, will need to hold a high level of amenity, be designed through careful design, and will need to celebrate a sense of place by managing views towards the broader context. Based on this, I consider that a 6-metre height limit setback of 25 metres need not be the final desired outcome for this building restriction area if a greater level of built form be contemplated. Further, from a landscape perspective, a potential building node around the commercial precinct on the Harrods Drive State Highway 6 intersection could positively respond to the emerging urban context and deliver a high amenity outcome. However, how this is delivered has yet to be tested, so I endorse a framework to enable this. And secondly, Mr. Blakely's evidence in relation to his own submission addresses the 75-metre setback. I have already commented on the reasons why I consider a reduction in the setback of 75 to 25 being appropriate in my evidence in chief. However, I wish to comment on Mr. Blakely's evidence to the Wakatipu Basin Landscape Study recommending a 75-metre setback for this area. I have not been involved in the study, in the Wakatipu Landscape Study, or in the development of the TPLM structure plan process. However, I note that the master planning has been applied to the TPLM is still evolving as part of this process. That's my summary landscape evidence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bentley. Now, questions. Judith.
None for me, thank you.
Puani.
I have one, and it's in relation to Coronet Peak. We've had lots of people, lots of submitters identifying Coronet Peak as a vista or a view, where your submission or your summary identifies remarkable Cecil Peak and those other views. And I'm just wanting to understand if you're on the same landscape or whether there's a priority for the other views, or just trying to understand why there's a focus on Coronet, I suppose, and you have focused on that. But might be an opportunity for you to give me a better understanding.
Sure. Well, Coronet forms part of the landscape in which the Wakatipu Basin is part of, and it's a prominent peak in views from that, particularly the State Highway 6 corridor. Probably prominence has been placed on the Remarkables and other immediately surrounding mountains as forming that immediate backdrop to Ladies Mile. That's not to say that Coronet Peak is part of that more distant landscape context, but it provides a role, it provides part of the understanding and sense of place of the Ladies Mile area. So I don't think any particular focus needs to be on Coronet Peak per se as a viewpoint. I think in the expert witness statement, it was agreed that there was no particular viewpoint that was determined. The views are transitory through the corridor. As you move through, you get views of the mountainous landscape that forms the backdrop to the area. So it's, in my view, a collective sort of understanding of all of those mountains and how they form that context. There's not one specific viewpoint.
And my follow-up to that is, within the setbacks in the corridor, they're considering some large trees and vegetation and those sort of things that may be restricted from Queensland Country Club's view of that direction. Having highlighted the other vistas available to you, do you have concerns or not? Not really.
I think, to be honest, some of those cross sections that were presented to you illustrated trees that were extremely large and possibly would never even get to that height, especially in this climate. So I think that the trees that would be likely to be put in as part of the Ladies Mile would assist in filtering and softening part of the building facade rather than block views. I mean, the majority of trees used along the corridor are exotic, so they lose their leaves, so there will be a seasonality element to those views anyway. But I don't, in my view, think that they will necessarily truncate views further from that corridor.
No, thanks. Good, thanks, David.
Thank you. Gillian?
I'm just trying to find something in a hurry, and I might not be able to, but one of the things that strikes me is there's a lot of comment about the deciduous trees and exotic trees, and I can't find a reference in a hurry, but there's a requirement or within the draft provisions, there's reference to Indigenous species. I'm curious about your thoughts around this. So there's a desire to have that sort of typical Otago look with the exotic trees. How do you feel use of Indigenous vegetation fits within this? You talk about heights of trees, and for the life of me, I can't actually think of what native trees that you would have of any height or any sort of significance in a landscape would be. What are your thoughts?
So is this on part of 4.2, the objectives and policies, preferring the use of Indigenous vegetation that naturally occurs or previously occurred in the area?
That's right, that's the one. It's just all the landscape people tend to come back to those trees that we're very familiar with in Otago, which are all exotic. So from a landscape perspective, how would we be creating that space with Indigenous species? What sort of species would we be looking at?
Well, that's a good question, because I think that obviously there's historically exotic trees have been used throughout the district, and it's created its own sense of character and sense of rural idyll, which those first pioneers brought to this place. And that sort of that mentality around those trees, the oaks and the birch and willows and things, have all sort of contributed to a deep-rooted sense of character that we all appreciate that this place contributes. Native trees, such as the southern beech tree, are very appropriate to be used in this context, along with tussocks. We've seen new developments such as Jack's Point, where they've celebrated a lot more native vegetation to be used in those areas. The hills landscape, and Millbrook also celebrates a lot of native vegetation within the district. A lot of it tends to be used more within the ecological sense, particularly stormwater or rainwater runoff areas, so particularly soakaways. Typically they're slow growing, like any, due to the climate, but I see no reason particularly why native trees shouldn't be used more prominently. Often they display less seasonal variety, so it comes down to aesthetics, I think, a lot of the time. So there's an added level of permanence about their character and shape. So I'm reasonably open about what type and species would be appropriate or used, but it seems to me that if you're trying to consider a more applied and consistent character along that corridor, quite a lot of those existing trees, particularly on the country club side, are exotic, including sort of hawthorn, which do, so it would be sort of echoing those type of trees that would.
Right, thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah. Okay. This issue of the setbacks is a live one. There's a lot of disagreement, not just between the designers, but there are other experts that have given us other reasons why setbacks down to 10 metres might be the way to go. So we'll start by testing with you your summary where you referred to the importance of the setback having some, consistency about it. Did you mean a consistent depth?
Yes.
And would that apply across the entirety of the zone, regardless of land ownerships, or just for individual landowners?
No, I think a relative consistent. I mean,
Okay.
I think yes. Yeah.
Simple question.
Yeah.
North and south of the highway, same one, consistency, or is there a case for the north and south, each side being consistent, whatever it is, but they could be different? What's your view there?
I think it comes back to what you're trying to achieve.
Okay. What do you think it's trying to achieve?
It's trying to achieve a high level of amenity along that transportation corridor. It's trying to provide a level of spaciousness along that corridor, and it's providing an element of ability to appreciate the context in which the Ladies' Mile plan change is.
Okay. So in light of what you've told me you think it's about, in your view, does that justify the consistent depth of setback on both sides of the highway or not?
I think consistent in a sense where at the moment there is a 75-metre setback, which and then backed by low density or extremely low density housing, and a smaller setback to the north where there is a higher level of density and higher heights of buildings. In my view, if you're trying to, and this is probably more a question for Ms. Rennie around.
Well, I'll deal with her next. So, just as a landscape expert, you just focus on what you think it should be about.
In my view, there should be a level of consistency, particularly, and not only over depth. I possibly would correct myself in that regard, that there would be a design element of built form and gaps between buildings and pallets of trees.
One of the things I'm trying to get my head around is that along the length of the zone, the proposal is to have quite a wide variation of land use types and opportunities.
Yep.
So there's not going to be consistency
That's right.
in an absolute sense of land use. So let's put that aside.
Yeah.
Within that context, what does that mean for the setbacks? Now, you started talking about the north side and taller buildings, and you didn't actually finish the thought, which I'm very interested in. Were you saying that taller buildings justify a smaller setback on the north, or taller buildings should have a bigger setback on the north?
I think that taller buildings, again, it comes down to what you're trying to achieve, I think, with the plan change. And, you know, from a landscape point of view, the key landscape elements and key landscape values are associated with the broad mountainous context. So that's the roches mountaineuses, that's the mountains, the integrity, and key values are being retained by because the plan change is not affecting them. The only effect that's occurring is the views towards them. And the setback, in my view, under the low density, particularly from the Queenstown Country Club, and that's been our primary focus, is maintaining some semblance of views towards the Remarkables in those southerly views. So reminding ourselves, of course, that just to the north or just to the east, you've got an open space precinct where you will obtain unfettered views towards the Remarkables. And so that, in my view, retains a sense of openness along that corridor. And of course, the setback is irrespective, it doesn't really matter with regards to the open space corridor, because the open space precinct, because of the fact that it's an open space. For me, it will be a balance along the Queenstown Country Club site to get a key design outcome that reflects the existing built form that's at the Queenstown Country Club and what's experienced along the rest of the corridor. So it would be a fine balance, which is why I support some of the provisions that Mr. Farrell's put forward over the discretionary aspect of design.
Okay. I haven't taken much of an answer to the question from that, but I do appreciate your starting point that you've been focusing mostly on one side, and that's fair. So let's try again. Should be consistent, not necessarily the same on both sides, and you talk about views to the mountain. But then you talked about the open space precinct will provide lots of views, and then the country club providing a balance and a mediation, which to me doesn't speak to consistency of outcome. That speaks to recognising different outcomes, which doesn't necessarily support your first answer, which was there's a need for this consistency. So I'm still not understanding what, in your view, is the basis of the setback across, let's just focus on the southern side. And you've told me what you think it's trying to achieve, which I really appreciate. So let's just work forwards on that. This idea of views and spaciousness and openness. You did talk about the scale of the trees shown on some of the cross-sections, and we've tried to get other witnesses to tell us what that means and how dense the trees would be planted and what views you'd actually have and what periods of the year. You heard the question that says the district plan already says there should be a bias towards natives, which aren't the same thing as most of the trees we've been hearing about. And so what do you have in mind within this setback in terms of planting if your objective is spaciousness and openness and views? Does that not lead to less trees, smaller trees, less gaps, rather than more trees, more canopy, more foliage?
Well, it's quite a long corridor.
Yep.
It's quite a long frontage, and I think the gaps between the existing trees varies.
Yep.
You've got
but you've said it should be consistent, and other witnesses have said it
consistent
too.
in character. I think
Right.
is more possibly what
Okay,
I actually
okay,
mean.
okay,
If
that's good.
that is helpful.
No. At this point, I'll be upfront. I've had a lot of designers tell me their ideas, and none of them have actually explicitly said what they think it should be.
Yeah.
And so I'm in a state of total confusion across the board of why we're doing this and what it will achieve and how methods can be put that will be tested to achieve it.
Yeah.
So that's not a criticism of you or anyone. It's just a situation
Yeah.
of not understanding but hearing it's really, really great, whatever it is. So let's talk about the consistency of character. Is the country club going to volunteer to vest that strip in the council? Do you know, Mr. Manhattan, you can help me with that? Or does the country club intend to continue owning all of its land, including the setback?
Understand that there would be the trail, which would be intended to be vested, but otherwise I understand the country club would retain ownership.
And so would the council designate or try and propose a subdivision on the country club's? I'm trying to understand why the country club is going to lodge a subdivision when it's already developing a retirement village that normally does stay in one title of ownership. Mm-hmm. So what is the country club intending to do that will provide this vesting opportunity?
Certainly. So,
Because you could just build a trail on your land and say, public can use it, here's an easement.
correct. There is a question as to then the ongoing maintenance and those costs, and so that would might be a driver for that. Beyond that, you're right that generally, as far as retirement villages, that they tend to retain ownership.
So what I'm trying to get my head around is how we achieve a consistent character in the context of a piece of land that the landowner, unlike other sites that probably need a subdivision consent at some time to do anything, your activity seems pretty well established. I'm trying to understand what methods would require this consistency of character to be achieved, because I don't see any at all other than a setback.
Certainly.
Whatever that is.
And I think the other bit from my perspective is that that will be a challenge to the extent that any planning framework is enabling, and so it does rely on people making use of the provisions, and so it is still about setting the overall objectives for the area. As to what extent those end up being delivered does come down to the intentions and aspirations of each individual landowner within the area. But certainly take your point that given the model of retirement villages, that's less likely to result in subdivision and those outcomes being achieved.
Okay, thank you. So Mr. Bentley, with that in mind, what was your assumption or understanding of how along the frontage of your client's land, whatever this setback lands on, how were you assuming it would be delivered or planted out? Who were you assuming would do it, and how would that consistency have been achieved?
Well, I guess there's already an existing easement already in place, an agreement with the Queenstown Country Club and the council over that.
That's for access, is it?
For planting.
For planting.
And for access as well.
So, and that's in favour of the council to do planting,
Yes.
whatever it wants.
So that's under the control of the country club, to manage that, but provide an easement for public to obviously use that land.
Okay.
Of course, when we did the joint witness statement, there was an understanding that there would be a level of what's already occurred in that 75 or the 120 metre setback would be sort of replicated. So it was an understanding that there would be clusters of further villas along that frontage, but a bit closer. So the landscape treatment would be reasonably consistent with what you can see now, albeit without some of the level of spaciousness being slightly reduced, and the level of tree planting being reasonably similar. Now, I've also been quite keen to look at the underlying low-density suburban residential provisions around what that enables, which is slightly higher level of density, higher level of built form that actually the country club currently has. So, but none of this has been particularly tested. It's not been tested by the council through this process.
Well, it's been sort of tested to the extent that I have the scars of the Frankton Flats plan change, when all this gateway to Queenstown and arrival to Queenstown, all the same argument was made, and we can all go and look at what we think about Bunnings in the warehouse. But that was all tested. It's actually been done.
Yes.
The argument is now whether that is still part of the gateway or arrival or whatever, it's now stretching eastwards. That's where we're at. So I think, in fairness, it has been at least sort of tested.
Yes.
Maybe not on this bit of land, and maybe not on both sides of the highway being urbanised in the same planning exercise.
Yes, yeah. So in terms of an outcome, that would be a setback that would respect the amenity of the corridor, whilst also maintaining the same characteristics of what's there. So I completely understand your point. There is a completely different character to the north, what's being proposed, to what's the character of the south. From a landscape point of view, my stance, particularly at the joint witness statement, was basically more of the same for the country club.
Okay, understand. And you've talked about 25 or maybe 20 or maybe 18.
Potentially, yes.
There's a chicken and egg issue here for us, which is not just a landscape one. We're being told that to make any of this urban outcome work, the highway needs to be speed reduced to 60 kilometres an hour, which is the requirement for safe signals to be installed, which is essential to then create safe pedestrian cycle opportunities. But the only way the engineers are telling us to get a natural speed environment that drivers will respect is not to have a massively open rural highway feel. It has to have an urban feel. And the council's own traffic engineer has told us it should be 10 metres to create an urban condition that will allow the speed environment to be delivered, which then allows the signals to be safely put in place, which then allows the crossing, which allows the integration, which is central to the whole thing happening. So
that's along the whole corridor.
We're being told 60 kilometres per hour needs an urban edge. Now, whether or not we accept that or agree with it, it's pretty unusual to have traffic engineers giving me the evidence on urban edge, not urban designers and landscapers, but whatever, that's what it is. But if we were persuaded to agree that, in fact, this whole plan change can't work without a complete change of how this entire piece of road operates, that necessarily changes everything about its character and what it does and what it has done and what previous studies have thought. Is that fair?
Totally, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
If it was a 10-metre-ish strip, would that still provide a sufficient sense of spaciousness and openness to achieve some amenity, some views to the mountains, noting that's also a function of building height behind, and in the case of the country club, we know what that is, and there's the open space precinct. Would that still achieve something of the outcomes you're interested in, or are we actually being do we have a classic resource management, we have to pick a winner, they can't all coexist?
No, not at all. I agree that potentially that could be entertained, and I think it certainly does lead to my query around, I guess my prefacing around a lot of this as being the actual resource consenting of those, of what's being proposed, because ultimately I'm relying on that low density suburban residential where there is a sense of openness that's implied with that level of development. If we're talking buildings being closer to the highway, potentially higher, potentially multi-form, then you're looking at a slightly different outcome. And if I can help you in any way, as I've said, 97% of the district is an outstanding natural landscape. Nearly every place you go in the Queenstown Lakes context, you see mountains, you see and celebrate the sense of place that brings with being in Queenstown. Ladies Mile is an important corridor. It provides that sense of arrival. It presents some form of a gateway into Queenstown urban when you're travelling from that direction. But in my view, it's no different to anywhere else. There's no particular special characteristics from a landscape point of view that would signal this as being completely different from the southern corridor down to Jack's Point or McDonald Road in the Wakatipu Basin. So each area brings its own special characteristics, each sense of place, each landscape values. And I think it comes down to how the council, particularly you as a panel, want to understand what Ladies Mile as a master planning exercise, as a plan change actually brings to this area. So in my view, from a landscape point of view, reducing the extent of that setback could potentially work really well. Okay. However, it's how it's managed, how it's designed.
All right, let's sum up one concluding point that I just want to confirm with you. At 3 times in the answers you've given me, you have referred to the importance of understanding what is the plan change trying to achieve. And what I've understood that to mean in practical terms is that the landscape response for the highway needs to be set in the context of that planning framework. I don't want to say be subordinate to it, but follow that, rather than what can sometimes happen, which is here's a landscape imperative so essential, the policy framework has to follow it. I've understood you at 3 times to be saying actually sort out what the planning vision is and then coordinate the best landscape response you can within that. Have I got that right?
You've got that right, because some landscapes require very specific response because they've got a high level of sensitivity, they've got a high level of value. This is flat rural land with pretty views towards the mountains. And
look, I appreciate that. And that's not to take away from all the other things your evidence has covered too. It's just the landscape issue is the one I just have the most uncertainty of. That's why we've talked about it at extreme length and pain. That's all right. Thanks for that.
no worries.
Just one very brief question from me because they've been extensively covered, but it's just yes, it's up to the variation, and just that discussion of the variation will drive the landscape. What do you see the variation in delivering? What change in character?
The variation will change the character ultimately from rural setting predominantly to a much more urban, more manicured landscape. Of course, the landscape values inherent within Ladies Mile will change. But with that will come a new character, will become a new amenity, and I think it's really how the amenity side is driven through this plan change, because inherently those broader landscape values will be protected because they're not part of the actual plan change.
And just on that, therefore, the setback should reflect the urbanisation of Ladies Mile?
The setback needs to be commensurate with a high amenity outcome, and how that's delivered how that's delivered is needs to be tested.
Okay, and we can pick that up with Mr. Farrell, but also with the joys of urban design. Thank you very much, Mr. Bentley.
Excellent. So the next witness is Ms. Rennie, and so again there's a short summary statement that she'll be speaking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want me to perhaps start at paragraph 1.8?
Oh, that sounds good without having opened it. That sounds very good. Definitely there's no need to repeat.
Yeah. So I'll
repeat
skip.
Things.
I'll skip. I guess the background set out in my evidence, and and jump to more recent times and the expert conferencing with the urban design experts. So during the urban design expert conferencing held on 1 November, there was broad agreement around a 25-metre setback on the south side of Ladies Mile with relevant built form controls in place. In addition, the experts also agreed that there is potential to support the urban form outcomes of the town centre and community facilities with appropriate civic or urban development around the Howards Drive intersection. The length and depth of setbacks during that session were not agreed by the experts. However, the council indicated they were open to some changes with regards to the setbacks in relation to Howards Drive intersection and that it warrants a more nuanced treatment. During the second expert conferencing session held on the 24th of November, a number of design assumptions were discussed, along with a series of alternative cross-sections in the context of a reduced speed limit of 60 kilometres per hour. However, no exact agreement on the cross-section was reached. In relation to the south side of Ladies Mile, all parties agreed that 25 metres is an appropriate maximum setback, but that we are not looking for symmetry between the north and south sides. All experts agreed that a built form and/or landscape response that helps safely manage the 60 km/h design speed is appropriate. Generally agreed that urban design landscape features can create the side friction as an important part of this. It was also agreed that tightening up the cross-section as much as possible was advantageous to utilise land efficiently, reduce walking distance across the corridor, and achieve a positive built interface with the corridor, while still maintaining the unique sense of place, landscape amenity, and recognising the importance of this gateway into Queenstown. As outlined in the second joint witness statement, I consider that there remains an opportunity to further refine the setback approach along the Queenstown Country Club site frontage, and I set out a recommended strategy below. So in terms of the Howards Drive Ladies Mile junction aligning with the commercial precinct, I recommend a build-to line as close as possible to the transport corridor boundary surrounding this intersection. I consider that this should be consistent across all four frontages of the proposed signalised intersection in order to achieve an integrated and legible built outcome at the node. This will support the proposed commercial precinct, including optimising the width of Ladies Mile, maximising development opportunities within the walkable catchment, further reducing severance, encouraging lower speed limits, and increasing the convenience for pedestrians and cyclists moving from north to south. The alternative cross-section tabled at the expert conferencing outlines a 12-metre build-to line for the proposed commercial precinct on the north side of Ladies Mile, and a 14-metre build-to line to the south. These provide useful guidance on a possible setback framework that could be adopted for the QCC site at the junction of Ladies Mile and Howards Drive. I have attached a marked up version of the alternative cross-section at the end of my summary, which demonstrates that a 12-metre build-to line would also be possible on the south side of the signalised intersection. In my view, the extent of the country club site frontage that could align with this commercial precinct is approximately 100 metres from the intersection westbound and approximately 50 metres southbound along Howards Drive. This extent of developable land would enable a future development footprint of a sufficient scale to anchor the southwest corner of the commercial precinct. I recommend the permitted activity standard for height of buildings within the node is 2 stories and approximately 8 to 10 metres. This would result in a built form that will support the overall legibility of the commercial precinct, although not as tall as the frontages on the northern side of Ladies Mile at 13 metres. Given the above, some refinements will be required to the variation provisions to support the QCC node under the lower density suburban residential zone. I recommend a bespoke policy and assessment matters are developed in support alignment with the relevant Ladies Mile provisions relating to the QCC node and commercial precinct in order to ensure a well-designed and integrated node. These refinements should ensure that a range of land uses are possible to support activation of the node. So moving on now to the remainder of the Queenstown Country Club frontage. Beyond the node, I support an amenity landscape and active mode approach for the remainder of the frontage. I consider a maximum build-to line could be in the order of 18 to 20 metres along the frontage. I consider that this will provide sufficient space for an urban amenity zone comprising 2 rows of trees and an active mode footpath of around 4 metres. I have marked up the cross-section tabled in the expert conferencing at the end of my summary. Given the above, I recommend some minor changes to the revised provisions, with any development proposed within this 18 to 20 metre build-to line as a discretionary activity, with development beyond this through to, and I note, rather than 120, it should be 75, and Mr Farrell will talk to this, as a restricted discretionary activity. The matters of discretion within the low density zone set out in Rule 7424 of the variation provisions are relevant to both scenarios. I recommend that, given a change in context since approval of the Country Club, the reference to is commensurate with existing buildings within the Country Club and the approved development plan of the SH160140 in Rule 7424, Clause A, be deleted. This information requirement is no longer applicable, and the assessment matters outlined are sufficiently robust to achieve a good urban design outcome. Finally, proposed standard 7514 includes a height limit of 6 metres for the Country Club, with within 120 metres of the boundary with State Highway 6. I support a height limit of 8 metres instead of the 6, although I acknowledge that the landscape experts have considered 6 metre height limit appropriate. I consider that an 8 metre height limit is appropriate in the context of the assessment matters and will enable greater flexibility for future built development.
Thank you very much, Ms Rennie. Now, questions. Judith?
No questions.
No? Bawani?
No.
Gillian? No? Ian?
Yep, thank you. Your paragraph just now, the summary, 1.18, you mention the need for some refinements, bespoke policy. Is that all stuff that Mr Farrell has done, or is that stuff that somehow needs to be done?
It might be useful if you have Mr Farrell's
No, that's fine.
statement.
It has been done. That's all I need to know. Or not.
Not that I'm aware of.
Right, so it's not Mr Farrell's
So
chambers.
what
That's fine. We just need to understand what connects where. So I'm not going to ask you to write provisions on the spot. I just wanted to know if it's still to be done.
That's my understanding. Mr Farrell has tabled a new policy to Chapter 7,
Yep.
which he will talk
Yep.
to. But my understanding of that policy is that's more specific to the broader frontage and may not speak specifically to the commercial
Yep.
node.
No, that's totally just a pure question of dotting the I's and stuff. So then, Ms Rennie, you sat patiently while I asked a series of questions with Mr Bentley. what I'll do instead of trying to put them all to you is just ask, you've listened to that, do you have anything you wish to add or agree with or disagree with? I'm particularly interested in Mr. Smith, the Council's traffic engineer, Shield, sorry,
Yes.
telling us that in his view, to get a 60 kilometre per hour environment, that would be sufficiently convincing to motivate a third-party highway operator to put signals in. He feels that's more like 10 metres maximum. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that matter.
Yep, thank you. I think a 10-metre setback could be workable. I think it comes back to having that clarity of vision as to what the outcome we're looking for the corridor is. I guess a lot of conversation has happened around the urbanisation of the corridor, and it's been a bit of an iterative process, and I guess clarity of vision is critical, because if we're saying this is an urban corridor, then we should design it as an urban corridor. And I think that a 10-metre setback will enable the appropriate provision of some amenity and active mode and a good relationship between the built form and the corridor itself. So I can appreciate that a 10-metre setback will heighten that sense of an urban outcome and better, I guess, address the friction issue that's been discussed.
What I've also taken from your answer, and I'll put to you to confirm whether I'm right or wrong, is it's a similar emphasis as Mr. Bentley, which is figure out what the vision is, and then within that vision, what role should the corridor have, and then within that, what is the appropriate landscape response? Is that a fair hierarchy of how it should be done?
Yes, that's a fair outcome, and I think I would just like to add that it's important that we look to the future here. There's a lot of work and effort gone into where we've got to, but we need to look to the future, and particularly in supporting the public transport role of this corridor, and walkable neighbourhoods and all those attributes, and so those are key considerations.
Okay, look, the last question following on from that then, when we were talking to the council's witnesses, one of the three urban design people put forward, Mr. Lowe, in defence of a more spacious setback requirement, and although it hadn't been articulated and he was unable to do it with any specificity, but a lot of trees and rows of trees, he put to us that he didn't think we would be able to rely on words to the effect of architectural quality alone or built form quality alone, that there was a need for lots of landscaping along this corridor to get a suitable amenity outcome. A, do you agree with that proposition generally? And B, if you do, are there any additional provisions or matters that the plan change could or should include, not asking you to give us specific solutions now, that could ensure that if we were entertaining a lesser setback, but we also had concerns about a great outcome, we could have more confidence in the built form properly lifting its own, carrying its weight, if you like?
There was just conversations in the expert conferencing sessions around some design guidance, both in terms of the landscape outcomes, but also the built form. So that I think the conversation has continued in that space as to whether or not that's required. I think, given the importance of the overall variation and achieving a quality outcome, I think some of the perhaps the aspects of the master plan could be pulled through into a set of design guidelines that could help to achieve the high amenity and outcomes that are being sought. My understanding of the provisions is there could be some risk that you might not achieve that high quality outcome that you're looking for through the provisions. They may need beefing up a little bit.
Okay. I'm not sure how far I can take that further with you. Certainly, the open space precinct, I haven't got my head around what buildings might come to be proposed and what status would apply yet. Then we've got the country club, which is effectively the lower density suburban zone with some augmentations, and that is already in a state of some development. Then we have some other lower density residential precincts on that southern side. On the northern side, there's a reasonably low bar before one hits a restricted discretionary consent, whether it's by way of subdivision or commercial buildings or higher density type developments of more than, I think it's 2 dwellings. So on the one hand, at least some development in reality is already likely to face a resource consent. One conclusion from your answer could lead to, and I'm testing now the unintended consequence with you, are effectively a requirement for all buildings, however you measure adjoining or adjacent or facing, whatever the front line is along each side, gets caught in some mandatory consent specifically to deal with that quality of outcome along the highway. Is that a reasonable conclusion from your answer?
I'm not sure I quite understand your question, but I did want to note that I guess with the way the provisions are set up at the moment, I'm assuming the existing design guidelines that the council have in place, for example, the medium density guidelines, etc., would be the go-to point for developments being assessed.
I don't know about that. They might do. I'm not sure off the top of my head whether those guidelines are limited to apply to specific existing zones, which could be argued might not apply in the first instance to this separate zone without express reference, which may exist already in the provisions, and Mr. Brown's shaking his head at me. But possibly that could be one way that's already on the shelf that could beef up.
I guess the question is, are we trying to achieve a different kind of design outcome here to other parts of Queenstown? And if that is the case, then are the assessment matters targeted enough to achieve that outcome?
Well, in the first instance, we're just having a conversation of an appropriate quality along the highway, not necessarily all other design. But in fairness, I'm not sure those guidelines address specific design solutions along highways as a specific matter.
So just in relation to the corridor, I think that some kind of design intent or some kind of like what do we want the corridor to actually look like, and what are the component parts of it, and what is the standard we're seeking to deliver there is missing and needs some consideration. I think some thought has gone into it through the master plan process, but it's not evident in the variation.
Okay, look, let's leave it there, because I think we're getting to and in fairness to you, it's not your job to answer necessarily the faults you've found in the plan. All we can do is record them, understand them, which I think we do now. So I'll draw a line under it there, but again, I really appreciate your willingness to just jump right in on this.
It may just be worthy of noting that the Queenstown Country Club did have a package of design guidelines and a specific planting plan that has, I guess, resulted in the outcome you see today, whether that's of relevance or not.
Well, I'll tell you, let's reverse that. Do you recommend that we should consider it because you think it's relevant to solving this conundrum in its own modest way? And if you recommend it to us, we might look at it.
In relation to the corridor or the overall variation area?
The corridor is the bit I'm mostly interested in, and that's what my questions are focused on.
That mechanism enabled a consistency of planting and a certain design outcome in relation to the landscape layer along that frontage.
And is it fair to say along that bit of frontage that is the only existing existing document that expressly and explicitly talks about the frontage?
Yes.
Well, I mean, at face value, then it might be a relevant thing to put in the mix of this conversation of what and how the frontage should be managed, is to say, is there an example of something that already tries to do it?
There's an example. Whether it will get you the
Yep.
a more urbanised
Yep.
outcome is, I guess, the outstanding question.
But even if it's just the architecture of what does it actually cover, what does it talk about, what does it speak to, might be a useful framework, maybe.
Maybe.
All right, thank you, Ms. Rennie.
Thank you.
Just two things from me. Just firstly, in answer to one of Mr Munro's questions, you said if we're saying this is an urban corridor, it should be designed as if such. In your opinion, is it going to become, with the proposed zoning and the zoning plan, is it going to become an urban corridor? Or are you just saying others are saying it is, and if they're right, it is the case? I'm just interested in your opinion. Is this, if it's approved, an urban corridor or a rural corridor or something in between?
Yes, it's an urban corridor.
Thank you. And then also with Mr Munro, you talked about your 118 and a recommended bespoke policy.
Sorry.
This will be a little bit of homework, but rather than us or the council or anyone trying to do a recommended bespoke policy, it would be interesting and useful for us to see what you propose as a potential policy for that, if you wish to. It's up to your client, but it is much easier for us to have drafting rather than just someone recommending a bespoke policy. So that's something to ponder, Mr Munhinnock, with Mr Farrell.
Certainly.
But if you're interested in advancing that, please provide that sort of policy, and then any justification required to the degree needed through 32AA. But that's probably largely covered, but there might be something there. Thank you. Now, conscious of time, but we'll make a start. I've got no more
Thank
questions,
you.
so thank you very much.
Excellent. So final witness is
on.
Mr Farrell. Again, a very brief statement, essentially, and attaches some recommended changes. And so Mr Farrell will take you to those changes and his rationale for those.
Thank you. And conscious of time, if it's all right, I'll skip through the summary, try and respond to questions as they've come up, and then probably focus on the back page.
Perfect, that would be much appreciated.
So just
Thank you.
I'll draw your attention probably to 3.1, which just setting out that since I wrote my evidence in chief, these are the key factors that have changed from my point of view that's affected my evidence in chief. One is this idea of the speed limit changing. I think you heard from Mr Murray yesterday talk about, well, we went into this process under the understanding sort of 80k sort of road environment, and then now it's to be reduced. So my evidence of chief was written on the expectation that there was a higher speed, not going to be reduced as much. And then the intersection at Howards Drive would be a roundabout. Now I've heard that it's not going to be a roundabout, although I heard on Friday that it still might be a roundabout, but then it might not be if signals come in. So not entirely sure. As a matter of fact, you may be aware that the Country Club has been working with Pūtahi for a number of years now on that corner of its site, and the land has been acquired by Pūtahi to provide a roundabout. Experts now agree that there's a 25-metre setback is appropriate, or the building line restriction, building restriction area. And then further than that, we're now in this discussion of actually development within the building restriction area could be appropriate, as you've just heard from Ms Rennie. And the other factor playing on my mind as I sit here and write the summary is that the Country Club itself, as a submitter, is comfortable with the recommended relief that Mr Brown has put up. And so that probably, and I can talk through the amendments themselves, whereas there's a point of difference from my evidence in chief and my opinion as a planner versus the practical sense that does it matter because it's not in contention. So I might skip to the back page. The pages in between what I just said, and this sort of provides some overview of the reasons for my amendments. Before I get into the back page though, I might circle back to some first questions that you asked early on. Apologies if this is getting out of my lane. In terms of scope of setback, the submission from the Country Club specifically sought to delete the proposed building restriction area and associated rules on the QCC site. And coming back to Commissioner Munro's question around is the Country Club in or out, I go back to, and I'm currently looking at the online version of the variation as notified, and two particular plans come to mind. One is the Ladies Mile zoning plan, which clearly shows the Country Club land as being rezoned, low density along with the Doolittle land, and there is no red line on that zoning plan around the Country Club site. And then the next plan, the Ladies Mile structure plan general, which shows the red line that Commissioner Munro referred to. And my understanding of that red line is it's purely the structure plan outline, not the plan change or variation extent.
To clarify, Mr. Farrell, what I'm interested in is if the Country Club is proposed to be managed by way of an off-the-shelf existing zone, the lower density suburban zone, why does the structure plan have to extend into the front bit of the site at all?
I don't understand why. And throughout this process, I've been unclear. And initially, I sort of took the approach, why would the Country Club land not be included in the entire new zone? But I've come around to the position, I think as Mr. Brown has, that it is entirely appropriate
Yep.
to let the Country Club box on under the operative provisions.
Right. So does that follow that the structure plan extent should be moved northwards to exclude the site? That's where I'm getting hung up on. It's either in a structure plan area or it's not. And the zoning outcome seems to imply it's not. But then for some reason, we've got a structure plan extent still sitting on. And that's relevant to my mind because if it's only on there to the extent there's a building setback, I need to understand that, because if the building setback changes, then that line might need to change too.
Yeah, and I understand, and there's another inconsistency, the building setback, if it was 75, or as it was as notified, is actually outside the plan anyway. Yes,
I noticed that too.
So my understanding is there is no correlation
Okay.
here in terms of the methods. The only one where I'm not even sure of the mechanics, how the tree protection works. Mr. Brown will be able to answer that presumably, but I can understand the rationale of protecting trees in a structure plan, but there is no need to, given the current consent would require a consent notice to remove those trees.
Right. So let's just try and wrap this up because the council's listening and they can come back and tell us what they think they're doing. In your view, in light of where the balance of this plan change is going, the lower density suburban zone for your client's land, should the structure plan extent line remain on a bit of your client's land? Should it be expanded to include all of your client's land, even though as a result of the structure plan, the solution is a lower density suburban zone? Or should it be moved northwards to fully exclude your client's land because it's not really part of the structure plan, and to the extent there's a commonality of the frontage, there are these existing separate methods that take care of it anyway?
Option C.
Option C. Okay, thank you.
My understanding, I've been dealing with the Country Club from its outset, and there is no suggestion that the Country Club or Arvida would ever sell or subdivide this land in question in terms of the frontage, as far as I'm aware. There would be no need to do any subdivision given the current tenure arrangements. The issue of, I think you heard before that there might be some vesting. The only vesting that's occurred has been with Pūtahi for the roundabout. The trails are managed by way of an easement in favour of QLDC, and there's a private developers agreement in place as to the maintenance of that. The trails within the easement will fall on the council in the long term, but it's still private land underneath that. I could get into intended outcomes and all of that, but I suspect you might have some specific questions if you do. Turning to the actual amendments, on the back page of my summary, the blue text is what's different, what I'm suggesting, as opposed to what Mr. Brown has suggested. The policy is effectively a straw man. Mr. Brown and I well, you go first, no, you go first. And so this is the first attempt. There is, dare I say, not too much thought being given to the actual policy other than being consistent with what the RDA matters are, which themselves derive from where the experts have landed, urban design and landscape experts, and in terms of outcomes. And I'm certainly not wedded to that policy wording and happy to work to amend it if need be. In my evidence in chief, looking at Rule 7.4.24, I promoted a controlled activity status. I still support a controlled activity status. But I'm from a planning point of view, as I said earlier, Country Club are happy with it. Mr. Brown has talked about needs for an RDA. I don't quite understand why an RDA is better than a controlled activity status, especially when we were only talking about 21 additional units. And I'm just struggling to see why you wouldn't have a controlled activity status if you know the outcome. But I can support an RDA, and I'll sort of move down into the consent triggers, into why I oppose a non-compliant regime, and get back to a point that you've been talking about previously around managing the whole area. Some tweaks there that I've made primarily because I don't understand, for example, why Mr. Brown is talking about 120 metres as opposed to 75. And then just some changes to remove ambiguity. Ms. Rennie, we just heard suggesting in terms of information requirements, deleting and is commensurate with existing buildings. Ms. Rennie and I haven't talked about that specifically. I'm not overly concerned with that retaining in there, acknowledging that the country club includes 3-storey high buildings and a whole commercial node. Kawerau Park is still part of the country club, as I would interpret this provision. That probably does lead to some ambiguity as to whether it's in or out, but it was always approved under that original consent. So if you're wanting to be commensurate with 3-storey high buildings or commercial activities, that's already provided for in that policy, in that information requirement. Moving down to density, I don't understand where the 42 units within 120 metres comes from in terms of Mr. Brown's recommendation. That does effectively include 21 units that have already been built, which leaves room for a further 21 units within the 2 hectares that becomes available. Within the building restriction area itself, I'd support an overall full discretionary activity status. And again, for anything within the country club or this part of the land that we're looking at, I do not support the non-complying activity status, because to me the non-compliant activity status is about strongly discouraging. I think it's the language we got agreed by the court as to what that means in the Wakatipu Basin area, strongly discouraging something. And the evidence before you, and certainly listening to Mr. Bentley and Ms. Rennie, is that some type of development may be appropriate. So to me the full discretionary is sufficient. And acknowledging just the circumstance that we're in, if there's to be a closer look or even finer grain look at the BRA area and what development may be appropriate, may not be appropriate, then that's where you could look at different activity statuses. But at the moment, we haven't tested or given enough thought to where and what might be appropriate. When I say that, I mean I haven't seen council's evidence really test it. Apart from that, I'd just end with the context of full discretionary, that's within the BRA. The land itself, the 25 or 20 metres to the 75 is prime land to continue the existing character of residential development with the retirement village, and I just do not think that should be prevented or sterilised.
Thank you very much, Mr Farrell. We might adjourn just for morning tea and then have questions afterwards, just in case anyone needs to have a break and things. So we'll just take maybe 10 minutes or so and then come back in. And then apologies to the next submitter, but we might be 10 minutes later for the Kaitahu submission.
Just to flag that Mr Bentley and Ms Rennie may need to leave before then, but
unless they want to listen to what Mr Farrell has to say, which I doubt, they're very welcome to depart.
Thank you.
But just as a team, if you could think about being very clear what you are seeking, and then that can be provided to both us and the council and all parties.
Certainly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll come back in 10 minutes, just probably at about 3 or 4 past.
Just before we start the second session, the hotel will be having a fire test at 12 o'clock midday today. So there'll be a short burst of the fire alarm. We do not need to leave the building, but just so we're warned, we're all going to jump anyway, but just so you know. Okay, thank you. 12 o'clock midday.
You can see who jumps the highest.
So I think we're at questions.
Yes, I'm just checking. That's all good today. Kia ora koutou, welcome back, and we're with Queenstown Country Club. Helps if I turn on my mic. We're with Queenstown Country Club, and just questions for Mr. Farrell from the panel. So Judith?
None from me.
No? Hoani?
No, none from me.
Gillian?
None from me.
Ian?
Just one, Mr. Farrell. You'd have heard from both Ms. Rennie and Mr. Bentley a degree of uncertainty in what's proposed and a support for clearer expression through the plan provisions for what the setback is about, vision, purpose, and methods governing what, how, who, etc. Do you agree with them that there would be a need for or benefit in additional plan provisions wherever the setback number lands? Or do you feel that in fact the provisions already provide for and cater to it to be dealt with?
I agree with them.
Thank you.
And just from my perspective, there's two things more to pick up on. I think what you've said, the discussions, we've canvassed that and the provisions. The two things are just firstly that piece of homework in terms of if there are policies, etc., what might they be? The second one may need to tie this with some other admin matters, and it's more a general one, is we've had a lot of discussions about the setbacks, and there was the joint conferencing, which was very helpful, urban design and transport. A question as to whether another group of discussions might be useful, and just to see if there's some commonality that can be agreed between the relevant witnesses, rather than the council and the panel and everyone getting bombarded with lots of different positions. Whether now we've heard there may be some benefit, and I'm looking at you, Ms. Woods, but some benefit in terms of the potential additional discussions. And maybe you're doing those informally, and that's fine, but just wondered whether that would assist in terms of, if it's 25 metres, well, this is, and we've got the team here. If it's 25 metres, then these are the design things, this is the rationale for it, etc. Or if it's 10 metres, this is the design for it, this is the rationale for each, here are the policies, etc. Just so that there's the policy, we've heard that the variation needs to consider the setbacks, etc. We've got the road being very different to when we started the whole process, and it's just whether that could assist, well, certainly, potentially it could assist us, and this is where things are, and even if it's not agreed, at least it's narrowed the discussion.
I mean, I think there will definitely be, regardless of whether there's further conferencing or not, discussions with the council team in terms of what will form part of the reply. Just hearing today, obviously there's a lot more about not just the setback, it's what's in the setback.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you were envisaging that conferencing would
I think
as well?
I think from my perspective, and the rest of the panel can chip in too, but from my perspective, it would help, because it would help with that clarity of what are the trees, or which is all tied to what is the vision. And if we can get what is the vision, then the rest might hopefully, and I might be being overly optimistic, fall into place. Because in fairness to the council team, the vision potentially has changed, it may not have, but there's been this discussion about road speeds, about what's needed, etc.
Yeah, I think the only thing would be timing in terms of
Yep.
compensate, realise the tight timeframes
Yep.
that we're working with, and whether there could be.
And with Christmas coming up, everyone's busy, but it's just, well, I'll put it in a brief minute to everybody, but won't compel it, but do encourage it, because it will help all the parties and it will help the council and it will definitely help us. Just get some clarity, and if it's not agreed, that's fine. We'll make the decision. No, there's definitely no need, no pressure to agree. It's just let's see if we can refine it. Thank you. So that sort of relates to what you're saying, but a bit off on a tangent. So certainly from my perspective, we've heard the questions. The planning provisions follow the discussion that we've just had. So do encourage in terms of any tweaks, etc., that you may wish to make, and the policy type rationale that Ms. Rennie was talking about, just to please provide that.
Certainly.
If possible by sort of end of Friday, but if not, that's as soon as possible next week, but ideally close of play Friday.
Certainly, appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Farrell. I've got no additional questions. Your evidence and provisions are clear, and the discussion and the evidence of the whole team has put that all into very good context. Thank you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a couple of very final points from me. Certainly acknowledge the comments as far as the chicken and egg situation, as far as the transport side of things, and that's something that I've experienced in other plan changes elsewhere in the country, where there is this the urbanisation of an area being tied to what the speed limit is becoming an increasingly dominant issue, particularly from Pūtahi's perspective. The other aspect, just building on the questions of Mr. Farrell, as to whether the structure plan should be removed from the country club site. The key concern from the country club's perspective is if there were to be it being removed from the site, which would be supported, that the other changes that relate to the country club site that are part of the plan change aren't lost as well. So that's the live zoning of it, and that it's currently rural, and then the provisions attached to Mr. Farrell's statement are still absolutely sought, and so those are a separate point from that question of where the structure plan extends to.
Where that actual red line goes is different to the zoning.
Correct.
Yes. Yep. Thank you very much, Mr. Manhane.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Sweet.
You've got a clean copy. Yes. Yeah.
I'm going to start flicking through reading this with, I just need this. Sometimes paper is actually necessary for my thought process.
Thanks.
Well, kia ora korora. Welcome, and for the kaitahu submission, recognising there's different runaka, etc., and hapu involved, but we've read everything. Thank you very much for these summaries, and there's a lot of supporters down the back too. Welcome to the hearing. For those of you who haven't been to a hearing like this before, hopefully you find it interesting. And the questions, etc., that we'll put and the process that we're undertaking is to make sure that we fully understand the submission, but more importantly, that we leave a lasting legacy if we are to approve the plan change, which is an if, for both the district but also for the environment and the why. So in terms of the submissions and the evidence that has been exchanged, we've fully read that. Thank you both for your evidence. And in relation to the proceeding today and how you'd like to manage it, we're entirely in your hands, and over to you to proceed as you wish. Thank you very much. And Puani.
Kia ora koutou, nea haku mihi ki koutou, e paumahara ko mati whatarakatia, me te au ko hatu ki nei wā, hari atu rā ki tātou te hokora, e roko te kaupapa o te rānei, he uri tēnā o karatai, mei ka hapu maha o tākou, he mihi anō. Jana, tēnā koe, Michael, tēnā koe, Elsa, tēnā koe, whānau tautaku, tēnā koutou. From the point of view of whakawhanaungatanga, that might be as far as it goes. Ko aureki te mauka, waitaki tāua, taki timu te waka, koutou ka te māmoi wai taharapa wai ka te hawe nā iwi. Ko tākou te whenua, ko tākou marae, ko Hoani Langsbury ahau. And from a tikanga perspective, we opened the hearing with karakia on Friday, subject to everything going to plan, because we did. We'll close it with a karakia. Nō reira, tēnā koutou.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Is this working? Yeah.
We'll just, yes, you've got 2 thumbs up.
Tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou. Waitaha kāti māmoi koutou huoka iwi. Ko oraka aparima tōku runaka ko taku tāo te titi tōku marae. Ko hana nui te maunga, ko aparima te awa, no tāhu nā hau. Ko Bill Davis tōku paua, ko Jane Davis tōku taua. Ko Jada Davis tōku ekua, he kaimahi mātou mai te rōpū, nai tahu ki miri hiku. Mai raro nā runaka e whitu o te wahi paunamu. Ki puka te raki o tākou, hokanui, moiraki, waihopai, awarua me oraka aparima. Mai te rātaki o kā tīpuna, mai te koto o tūranga o ka mokapuna mō pōpō, mai ka maunga tapu o taki timu, tapu kawarau, tapu paharaki, ka puta ki te ki tai. Mai te tikanga me manaaki, ka Māori me ka Pākehā, o te taha, o te moana, o te ngāhere, a ka tangata katoa. E nei mātou e hono kākea koutou kia whakanui te kaupapa, a whakahirahira, toitu te marae o tāne, a toitu te marae o Tangaroa, toitu te iwi, a toitu te tiriti, mō tātua mō ka uria muri ake nei. Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. I wish to acknowledge the Chair and the hearings panel and all those involved in the proceedings who are tasked with the significant responsibility of safeguarding our waters, our land, and the well-being for future generations, ki te ki tai, mountains to the sea. Our connection, and by our connection I mean myself, my tūpuna, my mokopuna, our connection with wai Māori and biodiversity that helps sustain, forms an intrinsic part of the cultural identity of Kaitahu. The connection between mana whenua and wai Māori extends through time through whakapapa. The connection encompasses and envelops rangatiratanga and kaitiakitanga obligations, and it is our duty as the temporary stewards to protect the mauri of wai Māori. What happens in our headwaters causes cumulative effects that reverberate downstream, affecting kaimoana, fisheries, plants, taonga birds, and as such, the cultural identity of Kaitahu mana whenua and tangata whenua. To reduce the significant value of wai Māori is to reduce the identity of Kaitahu ki mana whenua. Over the past 4 years, I've spent a significant focus restoring Waifakaata Lake Hayes. Why? Because I have witnessed its significant deterioration within my lifetime. As a representative of Kaitahu Ki Mirihiku on the Waifakaata Lakehead Strategy Group, I've actively participated in fundraising, planting, supporting consents, and supporting positive outcomes for Waimāori freshwater and biodiversity within the Waifakaata catchment. The changes observed in Waifakaata are significant. They should be addressed. We're seeing reduced eel population, episodic fish kills, algal blooms, and more. I have concerns about the continued sediment discharges from urban development and increased town populations. We're concerned in relation to stormwater runoff and its potential to contain contaminants. There will always be a knock-on effect to expansion of our towns. Cumulative effects are real and they should be addressed in an integrated approach. The changes, I wish to extend my heartfelt acknowledgement to mana whenua, Mata Waka and Tangata Tiriti, who have been working on the catchment, building momentum for educating around manaaki to our whenua and promoting an integrated approach to restoration activities. To effectively implement a Kiutakitai approach, we must wholeheartedly embrace the concept of integration. By solely adhering to formal zoning and not recognising the importance of integration, we risk undermining the principles of an integrated catchment management, which require us to consider the broader environment, both upstream and downstream, from our kaina, our homes and our communities. The biggest concern around cumulative effects is distributed across Te Taiao. Cumulative effects commence at the top of the catchment and accumulate, affecting whānau all the way down to the moana, the coast. A Kiutakitai approach is necessary where we're not restricted by borders and regional zoning. The biggest test we face is to rise to the challenge and understand what shared success can look like across our precious catchments. Success is building the whare for whānau to live in and protecting the environment that sustains the whare and the whānau into the future. Both are necessary for survival. I have deep concerns about the changing narratives from a 1 in 100 year event to a 1 in 20 year event. Cumulative effects are real and they are present. The deterioration of Waimāori and Mahinga Kai values will be to our own peril. It starts with our small lakes, like Waifakaata, and it will end with our Great Lakes. As a Kaitahu Kaitiaki and a deeply concerned community member, I challenge the Ladies Mile developers to rise to the occasion and work on solutions and opportunities that do support the catchment to thrive. After all, the very reason people intend to move to this area is to live in the outstanding natural landscape. There is so much opportunity to contribute to the catchment in an integrated way, and I look forward to understanding what that actually looks like. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, thank you. Now, the panel will have some questions, so we'll just ask questions one by one, but feel free to the degree there's overlap for both of you, just to chip in and help. So there's no rigidity about only one answering if there is an overlap.
Kia ora.
Got it.
So Judith.
Morena, Mr Davis. I don't have any questions, but I do want to thank you for your evidence. I found it very clear, very direct, and assisted my understanding greatly, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, ma'am.
Moani?
Kia ora, Jana. Over the last 6 or 7 days, we've had various experts and QLDC staff and experts in front of us as well, discussing the impacts that will happen through, or the effects, or that are likely to appear on the landscape if this is provided with approval. And there has been a lot of discussion around stormwater and the management, and from the panel's perspective we've separated that into 2 stormwater streams, really what's coming off Slope Hill and whether that can be dealt with separately to what will effectively become the built environment, with other contaminants being introduced through additional road use and various other activities. From what we've managed to see so far with an integrated stormwater up to a 1% AEP event, we are looking to have that as the minimum or as close to it as possible for any rain events. You did touch on 1 in a 100-year event now being maybe a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 20-year event, and I think you're probably not far off being realistic in that. But looking at your evidence and your discussion, my question is, you're supportive of reducing the amount of stormwater that ends up in Lake Hayes and having it go to ground as an alternative?
Absolutely. And mana whenua are entirely supportive of building whare for our whānau to live in. And it's about getting both pieces right. It's about creating safe places for whānau to live, but not at the expense of te taio. And how that's managed and the technicalities of that, I believe to be further understood, what that actually looks like on the ground. And if anything, this is an opportunity to actually understand, one, development will continue here at home, and it has done in my lifetime. You know, look, there used to be dirt roads out on Mulligan's Road when I was a kid. So if we to continue at this rate, where's the manaaki back to the whenua which we're using to sustain ourselves economically?
And my next question relates to the manu, which I have an interest in this area, being part of a project that we introduced Buffweka to this region. There's 3 manu that are associated with the area to be developed, and they are likely to be displaced. And specifically looking at maybe our South Island pied oyster catcher, which will potentially have its foraging area completely changed and being forced down onto the Kawerau and other river areas. Do you see that as being an issue?
Mahinga kai values, any impact on Mahinga kai values is an issue for me. And it doesn't just occur at Waifakaata, as you know, Matua. It's cumulative and it's foreign and domestic. We're seeing the cumulative effects of human impact on our migratory patterns of our titi, and we're seeing the tōroa potentially extinct by 2050. It starts with a displacement and it ends with extinction. So the letter of expectation document delivered by Te Ao Marama and the cultural values assessment delivered by Ōkaha firmly states the expectations of mana whenua and that any impact on our cultural identity is not acceptable. So there's opportunities, right, for improvement. There's opportunities to build whare and sustain and uphold and improve Mahinga kai values. And it's about how do we get that relationship right so we can still continue to expand and build development, but also look at the wider narrative, which does not stop at a regional zoning. It's proven that these cumulative effects are impacting our estuaries at the bottom of the catchment, and that's where the ambulance at the bottom of the hill is. So how do we get it right up here? Our headwaters are the single most important suppliers of Waimāori for whānau. We have to get it right up here in the Central Lakes. It's vital, it's important. And we're not, look at Lake Hayes in the last 30 years. You wouldn't want to fall off your paddleboard in there these days. What is whakatipu Waimāori going to look like in the next 100? We must get this right, and it must come from a place of shared success. What does success look like for the developer? What does success look like for the community? And how do we get that balance right? We've got good evidence on ecological values, which are a priority, and we've got good evidence on cultural value priorities. I just want to understand how we can recognise that more in the catchment. We shouldn't be dictated by zoning. That's not how we operate. Sorry, I hope I answered your question there.
Yep, and I have 2 more. One relates to ecological values that were put in front of us by Dawn last week, and that is in relation to the manu and actually the displacement of those species reduces the roadkill which is currently associated with it? Is that something that you're supportive of?
I think there's a place for both strengthening for Western science and Mātauranga Māori within the catchment, and that we need to be working together to help understand how to sort of help that unfold in the next few years. So yeah, more of our whānau working with ecologists on the whenua to help understand how to uphold both Western science and Mātauranga Māori, which hold equal value.
And the last one goes to place as a whakapapa to Pokukura, which was the gateway to the development of the region going back some time. We've had a lot of debate about what the gateway to Queenstown is and where that actually is, and I'd be interested from your perspective as you're travelling into here where you consider the gateway to be. It's been said it is Ladies Mile, but is it before that, is it after that, does it change? Interested in your kōrero on that.
I suppose there's 7 runanga to talk to about the correct narrative there.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No, I'm just trying to figure out how to answer it without annoying too many of the aunties. Yeah, I think that's definitely needs to go back to all 7 runaka. Yeah, I know where my tipuna came through the Greenstone. Yeah.
No, all good.
Kia ora.
I'm good, thanks, David. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Gillian.
One of the key focuses for us around Lake Hayes and the effects of the variation on Lake Hayes is around stormwater. And Hoani's mentioned that the focus has been to get down to the 1 in 100 year event to ground, which is good for groundwater recharge and to avoid those discharges to the lake. That's just one aspect of urban development. And because you've been so involved in the work around Lake Hayes, I'm curious about your knowledge through the work that's been done there in terms of what the other urban effects are on Lake Hayes, other than just stormwater within those urban areas.
Lake Hayes is, why Lake Hayes? It's genuinely because of the amount of stakeholders on the catchment, right? We've got farmers, we've got NZ Ski, we've got a golf course, we've got communities, we've performed deforestation, there's wilding control, there's a whole lot going on. And so if we can prove what that looks like working together, we can hit any catchment. The other, there's a lot of good that's come out of this. Getting the Otago Regional Council and ORC and DOC and Friends of Lake Hayes and Mana Whenua actually sitting around a table has been a real positive out of this. And it'll lead on past when these Jobs for Nature projects continue. We've seen some of the key documents come out as well, ecological management plans, consents, and the cultural values assessments and letter of expectation documents, which is really only just formed in the last couple of years to help us guide where the priorities need to sit. So besides stormwater, we're seeing we've got the arrow augmentation piece coming up. All this focus at the north end of the lake around sediment control and what machinery do we need in Central Otago to actually control that amount and volume of sediment. How do we get that right? This massive focus from all our partners at the north end of the lake to have the rug pulled out from under us at the bottom end of the lake. It seems like a whole lot of community and a whole lot of partnerships that have come around to raise all this pūtea for the north end of the lake, and yet where's the integrated approach at the bottom? Because if we wanted to talk about stormwater as being one of the components that need addressing, we could. There's a lot of other pieces, right? We've pulled down a forest on Coronet Face. There is more consents coming in for the expansion of operations on the mountains from the ski field. There's more mountain bike tracks being installed. They're getting community out onto the catchment itself. So but we've still seen a massive decline in tonga species that exist in the catchment, and we've got good record of that, of what mahinga kai values used to be present within the catchment. So from the mana whenua perspective, it's looking at the biodiversity loss and understanding where we can get those gains first and foremost. So stormwater is one. The loss of biodiversity is another. The Apati Hono Tātai Hono assessment, which was conducted throughout the whole catchment, the Māori at the south end of the lake was at the lowest. So that piece there allows us to prioritise where our focus really needs to be. And at the moment, from our space is that the lower end of the catchment, there's a disconnection there, and that's a priority for us moving forward. And also the question is how can we have such a fantastic partnership at the north end of the lake and still be in here talking about integrated catchment management when I feel like we've almost missed a step when we should have been working with QLDC in the beginning to say, well, it's not just the north end of the lake, it's the south end of the lake too. So normalising this as part of the process in the early days when we're getting developments brought online could help mitigate having this conversation altogether. I hope I'm answering your question there.
You have.
There's also more monitoring stations that have been installed throughout the catchment to help measure like turbidity and other nutrients that are entering the lake.
So you're actually starting my answering my next question, which I haven't asked yet, which is great. In terms of the decline in the lake health, with all the work that's been done, is that primarily around sediment, or is it nutrients or other factors?
Not enough is the right answer there. It's social, cultural, economic, and environmental well-being, and there's many different indicators to be measuring off the catchment in general that we haven't even began exploring yet because we don't have the resources to. This is really about measuring hauora and health, and the health of Waimaori means good, healthy people, and so it's we need to start developing what that impact actually is having on our community. So when we're in rooms like this, talking about the success of our community and how to grow safely, we've got some data that actually backs up the impact. Not just from the ecological side.
Right, thank you. And then my last question was really around, so we've got the focus on getting stormwater to ground. The other question is really around when the developments happen in terms of earthworks and sediment control. In the history of Lake Hayes, has that, in your experience, has that been an issue when developments happen? The sediment loads to the lake has been a major contributing factor to degradation?
When I look at the story of fresh water, we're still having the same conversation that we were having 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that is, what is the standard of clean water? Clean enough that you can drink it. And so anything that has an impact on that narrative, I feel like we've got work to do as a community and as treaty partners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ian?
Just one, really. You've talked about, quite rightly, and I defer to your direct experience, about the cumulative nature of the issues and the importance of an integrated outcome.
Mm-hmm.
We are ultimately, though, limited in our ability to influence the rules going forward for one particular part of the catchment, the proposed zone. I'm really moved by your last paragraph about rising to the occasion, and I suspect we're part of that too, in terms of setting the rule book that those developers might then need to rise to. While you were running through your summary, I've been going through the proposed policy framework that would govern future rules in the zone, and the one that's relative to stormwater management which is 49.2.8 for those that are interested in that sort of thing. As I read it, could be said to not really be rising to much of an occasion. The relevant provision just says, and contributes to an integrated approach to stormwater management. So the question for you, if we accept, and I can't see how we wouldn't accept the declining health of the lake, the fact that this area of land is a contributor, shouldn't we just be setting a more ambitious goal? Shouldn't we be saying development in this zone should improve stormwater, lessen the adverse effects on the lake, or however we word it? Shouldn't that be, if we want people to rise to the occasion, shouldn't we be starting there? Do better. Is that fair?
I feel that personally, I don't have a good enough understanding of the process that it takes to get a development to this stage. And if anything out of that would be, how do you define an integrated approach?
Yep.
And if you're going to use the word integration, what does that actually look like? But also, it is about we're feel free to correct me here. Te Ao Marama and Ōkaha are neutral because we're pro housing for whānau.
Yep.
Right? And so it's about creating better relationships as well with organisations when they're wanting to go about doing developments like this. So we should be able to do both. And it's not about, I prefer not to be holding anyone to account, but rather growing a genuine understanding of how to do this the right way from the beginning, where it's like, how do we define success and how do we get there safely? So if we're saying that success and more housing for whānau is a good thing, how do we get there safely? From all perspectives, one of them is, if you're going to use words like integration or an integrated approach, well, the word zoning suddenly looks a little bit different.
What I know, when I asked you the question that you don't know, is that the council's stormwater expert has told us that as a consequence of the proposal to rely on soakage, which involves a form of storage to get that first run of contaminants and then filter through tens of metres to the underground aquifer, would have the effect, putting aside that 1 in 100 year frequency, which is, it's not always 1 in 100 year, but it's a scale of event that would overtop those. But anything up to the 1 in 100 year event, the council stormwater engineer is that actually going to have less stormwater going into the lake than is there now. And so when I asked the question about shouldn't we just be saying up front there should be an improvement, I had the advantage of knowing the council stormwater expert is already telling us that in fact, at least for a chunk of the time, there will be. Now that I've shared with you that the council's expert is telling us that there will be, at least in some instances, an improvement of the existing extent of runoff and sediment from this site into Lake Hayes. Would that then make you a bit more open-minded or supportive about setting a target up front that says, well, if you're going to improve it, let's just call it improvement, and say that's how we rise to the occasion, that's how we start setting a tone that maybe gets followed going forwards?
I suppose, it would come back to understanding how you define integration, and from our perspective, and by our, I mean my mokopuna and my tipuna, it's also about the whānau that will be living in those communities and the impact that will come because of a result of more humans being in the area. Stormwater is part of it, but it's also the knock-on effect from building communities. And there needs to be manaaki back to the whenua. So I don't think, like when we're talking about integration, siloing it, the kōrero, is not how we view it. It's actually about opening and expanding the different aspects and elements. As a result of stormwater, we have more whānau, we have more people. You move to Ladies Mile to go and do the Lake Hayes track, right? People are going to be using the lake, that it's going to be promoted. You're going to see shots of Lake Hayes in the background to sell whenua. It's why people move there. And to say that Lake Hayes and Waifakaata shouldn't benefit from that it's interesting, right? Genuinely, it's right there. So, yeah, I think that just understanding how we should be approaching even the conversation around, well, what does Manaaki even look like? Because it's not just about stormwater. It's about understanding strategically where are the best wetlands that we should be installing within the catchment in general. Because while we might not feel the benefits at Ladies Mile, the catchment is still feeling it. The whānau are still feeling it. This conversation could be about, we could be in Kingston or Glenorchy right now. If the priorities within this region are well known, then there should be a way and mechanisms in place to help support that integrated approach. We just so happen to be within 400 metres or 500 metres of Waifakata and the Ladies Mile development.
Can I just jump in from a planning perspective? Tēnā koutou katoa. There's also a policy in subdivision chapter 27.3.24.7, which is...
Hold on, I'll just look that up too.
Oh, sorry.
And just checking, Mr. Bathgate, that you have the latest version of that policy drafting.
Possibly not. I'm looking at Mr. Brown's rebuttal evidence. I know there is a later version, and I'm not sure whether this particular policy has changed.
What was the policy reference again, sorry?
27.3.24.7. Begins required design of stormwater management systems to avoid direct stormwater discharges to Lake Hayes and avoid adverse effects.
So the latest version of that one that I have, that Mr. Brown might pass across to you, was following, and you probably haven't endured the joy of watching the live stream to see the questions that we've put. But we've, as Hoani and Gillian mentioned, we've spent quite a bit of time in relation to stormwater with various experts. And part of the outcome of that was to put Waifakata at the front of the policy. The policy was drafted as a stormwater engineering policy. And I suspect from some of the discussions that have been had with Mr. Munro, additional tweaks might be required. But that's the latest drafting. And sorry, that was just an interlude to make sure your discussion with us was off the latest version. So back to you, Mr. Bathgate.
Thank you, Commissioner. I was really just going to point to that particular policy and say that I think, again, it's along the lines of avoid adverse effects and require an integrated stormwater system without being aspirational in any sense. And I think we'll get to this, I guess my evidence sort of, reiterates Te Mano Te Wai aspirations to both restore, to protect and restore and enhance the Māori of the Wai. So
that's that last bit that you said that I'm really interested in, because avoiding adverse effects of doesn't mean try and make things better.
No.
Doesn't mean enhance, doesn't mean improve. It just says don't make it any worse.
That's right.
And that's what I was trying to get to, is that where the narrative needs to try and broaden from what's currently being put to us, which is commendable for what it is, which at least says draw a line, but I think, inspired by the comments and the experience and working with this, should we be doing better, and should the language also be going beyond draw a line and say and actually contribute to betterment? And that's where I'm trying to get a sense from you. Is that something we need to be doing as part of an integrated approach?
What's the cost of going to be of a 1 in 20 year event or a 1 in 100 year event? Like, what's the cost of what's happened up on Bob's Peak? And is that going to be, who's going to pay for it? Because right now, the community and the taxpayers and ratepayers have been helping support the start of the Waifakata Restoration Project. And we've now been going on to start raising more investment. The community have done that with the support of the ORC, QLDC, and Mana Whenua. But what happens when we do get a failure and the system's overloaded? When we've just put $6-7 million into the north end of the lake. And it's the community that have done that. The hundreds of hours that have spent volunteer working in our schools. That's what I want to know, is where's the insurance policy? Are the community going to pick up that tab if we don't get this right?
I'll take those as rhetorical questions that I answer. But,
Yeah.
But I think it's very valid to ask people through the issue. So I really do appreciate coming along and engaging with you on the questions.
Thank you.
No, I just asked another one there, and I was listening to Mr. Barco's response where he used the term not aspirational, I think. And having listened to what Pūtahi and read their submissions when they were talking about mode shift, and having aspirational in there and lots of exclamation marks after it, there's expectations within this plan change that we should be being aspirational, and wanting to understand what that means from the point of view of a 20-year event should have zero impact from this development or from this zoning on the lake. And we have documents out there in the last few years, Te Mana Wai, Te Mana that are aspirational documents, and where that puts mana whenua from the point of view of the catchment. And now's the opportunity to tell us from an aspirational perspective what you want to be seeing on the landscape and in the Wai and those other areas that would be affected. Waimori, I presume I'm talking about here.
I'd like to see more the wetland, the Māori of the south end of Lake Hayes returned, first and foremost, and Mahingakai values upheld in that part of the catchment. Every unmapped wetlands mapped, cultural monitoring systems put in place by council and mana whenua, and more support in the advocacy space for what makes these important communities to live in. We've got to get the balance right between delivery, monitoring and advocacy, and there's a lot of work to do there. But make no mistake, we've got the largest NGOs in Central Otago working on this project. There's a lot of oversight, there's a lot of different strings that we need to pull to make it all come together, and we're entering to that next phase. So the strategy group exists, and it's the strategy group that is going and knocking on all the doors. We haven't had any developers come to us for a kōrero yet, and I think that's where it needs to start. Mātua is more whakawhanaungatanga on what is, we want people to live in these communities. Where are the priorities for the community currently? Because the people that live in this Ladies Mile development are also going to contribute both positively and negatively to the Lake Hayes catchment. So they're going to become a part of it.
And just to follow up on that, Commissioner, the Ōkaha and Te Marama have been doing some work via Koati Limited with Queenstown Lakes on blue-green networks, which is a strategic objective from the spatial plan. I reference it in my evidence. And while that work's still ongoing, it's trying to visualise what a blue-green network looks like from a kaitahu perspective. And I mean, I think for me, looking at some of the earlier versions of the master plan, while they weren't perfect, you could get a sense that there were stormwater corridors, which had the basis of potentially being ecological corridors within the variation area. And I guess, for the reasons that we've sort of moved away from being able to replicate that in the structure plan. But I think with taking that out, you sort of lose that sense of ecological connectivity within the area. So we're left with sort of little open space, pieces of open space provision here and there. But you don't lose that sense of, I guess, how it could hold up a mirror to the whenua and to the environment. So I think from my discussions with Jana and other Rūnaka people, it's about development that doesn't shoehorn the environmental bits in around the built form, I guess. It's about trying to understand what the environment is first and how Waimaori moves through that environment, and then design your development around that.
Is there a way as the planner between the two of you to capture what Mr Davis was saying with regard to that holistic aspirational approach and putting some planning language to the provisions or the objectives and rules that could be shared with us to enable us to give further consideration to the aspiration?
24.2.4.2.
Well, Mr Davis has got his favourite policy in the whole of the QLDC plan that he's going to reference in a second. But just firstly in answering your question, Commissioner, I think a lot of what we asked for via the Kaitahu submission in terms of blue-green corridors has been accepted by the Section 42A author. So in terms of that, objectives and policies, and I guess we can have that conversation around whether it's aspirational or enough or not, but I think it has been accepted, thankfully, by the Section 42A author. So we do get more of a sense of, you know, trying to provide ecological corridors, realising that these are both blue and green within the provisions. What that looks like in terms of a structure plan, or maybe there's some more distance to travel in terms of that, I don't know. But yeah, I think it's there in the objectives and policies.
Do you feel though that it goes far enough for net gain rather than no net loss?
I think you should always go further, and it's probably
Yeah, the word improving isn't used enough in this town. And we've got section 24.2.4.2 of the district plan that states to improve effects on the Lake Hayes catchment, and we suddenly just fall out of that zoning. That's something that needs to be implemented across the entire district plan, and actually figuring out the mechanism in which to measure that needs to be well understood by council, and I don't think it currently is, but at least we've got it in there, because it's a starting blocks to actually help redefine what that success looks like. Like I'd like to understand from a kaitiaki's perspective what that looks like, and I'd like to understand what it means from a community member, from a councillor, from a developer. And it's the same way that our country rolls in partnership, is understanding where we can gain some ground together. We need to tease that out further, what that tool looks like, what's the algorithm, is there an algorithm for moving soil, for development, for measuring the amount of stormwater that's coming off a catchment in general or a development, to figure out how to measure that, to say what that Manaki is. I think just doing a percentage isn't the right way to do it, but it might help solve a few, short-term issues, but this is a long-term problem, or opportunity, however you want to look at it.
And I'm aware I could talk on this all day, but
Yeah.
probably evidence has to be put at some point by Mr Bathgate, so maybe I stop my questioning here and see what comes to light as we move forward. I'm good, thanks.
Thank you. Just quickly, that policy number again. Sorry, you rattled it off so quickly.
24.2.4.2.
4.2. Thank you. Just saves me trying to flounder through and find it.
It's an interesting one. You'll have a community member going, I'm putting a garage in. Who can I donate $200 to? And it's like, well, this hasn't been put in place to hurt the community member. It's been put in place to help with these conversations. It's not, the measurement isn't understood properly for what that clause actually means, but the opportunity is there if we can get it right as a community on how that might be spent, because it's not just ecologically, it's all the other right? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr Davies. I don't have any questions. There's been quite a lot of them, and I'm just conscious of time and with Mr Bathgate as well. But to the degree we have questions for Mr Bathgate, the flip side occurs if there might be something that you'd like to add to that question. So, over to you, Mr Bathgate, and you've got your summary that you've handed up.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. Tēnā koutou anō. I'll try and read my summary in 3 minutes, because then that's when the bell's gonna go.
Good luck. But thanks for the reminder.
Yes. Kotahu are broadly supportive of the Te Pūtahi Ladies Mile plan variation as part of a wider spatial plan and master plan process. The Kotahu submission sought a number of amendments to better integrate Kotahu values and improve outcomes for Te Taiao, many of which have been supported by the Section 42A author. My evidence focuses on the key matters raised by the Kotahu submission, in particular the integration of Kotahu values, blue-green networks and the approach to stormwater management. My evidence examines the statutory and planning framework, particularly in relation to the relationship of mana whenua to Te Taiao, and also the approach toward Wai Māori. I consider the following aspects were emphasised or omitted in the Section 32 and Section 42A evaluations. Expression of Treaty of Waitangi principles at a regional level, the need to recognise and provide for the relationship between mana whenua and Wai Māori, including the effects on Kotahu wellbeing where resources and values are degraded, the need to have particular regard to the ability for Kotahu to exercise kaitiakitaka, the need to protect and restore the mauri of water, including the National Policy Statement, policy emphasis on improvement to water bodies and freshwater ecosystems, policy imperatives and higher order documents relating to stormwater management, the mapping of the southwest margins of Waifakata Lake Hayes, to which the Te Pūtahi variation area naturally drains as a regionally significant wetland. A Kitai or broader approach toward integrated management of all natural resources, noting also that the proposed regional policy statement has articulated a vision for the Clutha Mata'o Freshwater Management Unit. Didn't make it. The cultural evidence of Mr Davis has articulated some core Kotahu values, including Māori, kaitiakitaka and kitai, particularly as they relate to the Waifakata catchment. Speaking as a kaitiaki, Mr Davis discusses how the Māori of Waifakata has been diminished and how a kitai approach toward the catchment is required. Enhancing and protecting blue-green networks is a spatial plan strategy that aligns with Kotahu values relating to Māori, Wai Māori, kaitiakitaka and kitai. Kotahu submissions sought relief to expand the concept of blue-green networks to reinforce that these should function as ecological corridors as well as providing open space. The contribution that water-sensitive stormwater management solutions can make to the wider blue-green network, and the opportunities for incorporating Indigenous biodiversity in urban design. Most of the relief sought by Kotahu in relation to blue-green networks has been accepted by a Section 42A author, with some apparent omissions as set out at para 51 of my evidence. In relation to stormwater, the Kotahu submission sought changes to emphasise the need for an integrated approach towards stormwater management and to give effect to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and Te Mana o Te Wai. In broad terms, Kotahu seeks the protection of Māori and improvement to degraded water bodies, the management of Te Pūtahi stormwater as part of a far wider catchment that includes upstream areas as well as Waifakata and eventually the Mata'o, the use of natural or water-sensitive methods to attenuate and treat stormwater, and stormwater management that provides ecological benefits within a blue-green network. Much of the relief sought has been accepted by Mr Brown as Section 42A author, helping to embed integrated stormwater management into Chapter 49 and 27 provisions. The Section 42A author has also inserted a related matter of discretion into subdivision rules, added a new information requirement and incorporated the guiding principles for stormwater management from the master plan into assessment matters. Kotahu reliefs relating to stormwater that has not been accepted by Mr Brown is set out at para 68 of my evidence. Main relief not accepted was the inclusion of an integrated stormwater management network directly into the Te Pūtahi structure plan. An alternative approach proposed in my evidence was a non-complying activity status for subdivision, not part of an integrated stormwater solution. As highlighted in Mr Brown's rebuttal evidence, all expert planners have agreed via conferencing on the need for an integrated stormwater system and broadly agree with the Section 42A amendments, with some further amendments to reflect the results of stormwater expert conferencing. As an alternative to a non-complying subdivision activity status, the planner's joint witness statement also supports the inclusion of provisions for consultation with affected upstream and downstream landowners and kaitahu as affected parties in relation to stormwater management and the potential for limited notification of these parties. Expert agreement on the requirement for an integrated system intended to soak all stormwater up to and including a 1% AEP event is encouraging, and I support the amendments in Mr Brown's rebuttal evidence. However, I note that kaitahu retain concerns that a piecemeal and fragmented approach to a development of Pūtahi could threaten delivery of an integrated system. To that end, the suggestion from Stormwater Expert Conferencing of more detailed assessment and design material in the form of a stormwater management guideline is supported, although it is unclear how those will be integrated into plan variation provisions. In closing, the cultural evidence of Mr Davis challenges all parties involved in developing Te Pūtahi to collaborate in protecting and improving the mauri of all water bodies in the wider Waifakata catchment. This challenge is an expression of kaitahu kaitiakitaka. As my evidence demonstrates, the need to protect and restore the mauri of water as part of development is also required by higher order planning documents. Thank you. Happy to take questions, and just to note that I haven't listened in to the stormwater questioning, but I have seen the questions that you put previously to the experts and the responses to those.
Thank you very much. So questions, we'll start again with Judith.
It's my lucky day today. Thank you, Mr Bathgate. I have one question, and it's around your paragraph 2 in your summary. When you're talking about where you believe a number of matters have been underemphasised in section 32 analysis. What I'm interested in is whether, in your opinion, the underemphasis of these matters alters the overall conclusion of that analysis.
I think this has been a bit of a journey, like all these processes are. I think coming in as a witness for kaitahu, I probably have, and bearing in mind that the kaitahu submission is quite focused, very much on kaitahu values, blue-green networks and stormwater management, I probably had the benefit that the Section 32 and Section 42A authors who are sort of examining the proposal across all aspects of effects on tile and urban development, I probably had a greater ability to do a bit more of a deep dive into the likes of Te Mana o Te Wai, National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, the iwi management plans, the regional plans, and so that was reflected in my evidence that you have read. And I think in his rebuttal, Mr Brown has acknowledged my analysis and accepted it. And I believe that has partly informed his response and the sort of further amendments to those provisions. So I think to the degree that I've expressed comfort with where the provisions have ended up, but at the same time a little bit of uncertainty around how an integrated stormwater system will land in lieu of being, you know, upfront and present within a structure plan, say. I think to the degree that I'm comfortable with where it is, but with that overriding rider, if you like, of some uncertainty around how this is all going to play out in terms of implementation.
So that's a broad yes. Yeah.
A broad yes with some, a little bit of nervousness, I guess.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But having said that, sorry, just in terms of Commissioner Munro's earlier question to Mr Davis, I think there's always room to be a little bit, there is room still to be a bit more aspirational around Waimaori and restoring Maori.
Thank you.
Thank you, Puane.
I'm right for the moment, but I may come back then.
Gillian.
Just reading your paragraph 10, and it does come to actually one of the things that's been sitting in my mind for the last week and a bit, So if we achieve what our stormwater experts advise us can be achieved, which is getting the one up to the 1 in 100 year, or close to the 1 in 100 year event to ground, that reduces the discharge from the urbanised area to the lake, which is great. So for events above that size, there is an anticipation that it would ultimately flow to the lake, which actually comes to your point before, which is what happens above that size. So can I put it the other way round? If this was your land you were developing, what would you suggest if you can't get it all to ground? What is the next intervention that we could consider for events above that size to reduce the effects of the discharge for those large events on the lake?
I think secondary flow paths are something that has been raised by the stormwater experts, and the need for a management approach towards those. I think there's still, in my mind, and I'm by no means a stormwater expert, there's been modelling of what flow paths in high events look like in the current setting. There's still, I don't think, any understanding of what flow looks like when this area is developed, and we don't know the form of the development exactly yet. So that makes that a difficult exercise. So I think it's around management of those flow paths is critical, and having, I guess, some mechanism to slow those down as much as possible. Recognising that in those extreme events, we're not going to stop that flow. It's just how it can be managed, attenuated, softened in terms of any effects flowing through an urban area.
Okay, thank you. So that's both in terms of, so when you're saying attenuation, that's, you're thinking about slowing flows down, so you're avoiding what we typically have as stormwater pipes into rivers and lakes, obviously trying to avoid that, but also in terms of contaminants as well, trying to reduce as much contaminants.
That's right, from those first flush events, yeah.
And just a slightly sideways question for you. Have you been involved with the Otago Regional Water Plan and the work they've been doing around implementing the NPS for fresh water in the region?
The Land and Water Regional Plan? No, there's a couple of my colleagues have. I don't normally get dragged into these wet spaces. So at Ōkaha we have two planners that deal with Waimaori issues. I'm usually the dry
Okay.
planner dealing with everything else for my sins. So no, I haven't directly.
I think that's an unfair statement, really, that you're a dry planner. No, that's fine, thank you. I know that they're well down the path compared to some other regions, and I'm less familiar with the Otago Regional Plan. I know it's been happening in pieces, dare I say, and I do know that Lake Hayes has been indicated on their maps as an outstanding water body. So I will go away and check what the state of the provisions are in terms of what they're expecting for Lake Hayes as an outstanding water body.
Yes, and also I guess the proposed regional policy statement is informative, very informative. The land and freshwater provisions within that. So I reference, in my evidence, I reference the notified provisions, but if you look on the Regional Council website, the sort of reply evidence, there's been even further travel in terms of the reply evidence, bearing in mind obviously that they might not be accepted by the panel, but yeah,
Right.
it's worth looking at those as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ian?
I only had the one question that you answered proactively earlier.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, you probably just handed them back to Mr. Brown.
No.
You've got that latest policy? Just interested in that sort of more ambitious approach, and the avoid adverse effects from stormwater on Lake Hayes. Avoid now has its own whole cluster of issues, but just stepping through those, and then we'll come back to others. Integrated stormwater management system for the entirety of the zone. And you've raised concerns about integration. Both of you, what does it look like? From my current understanding, and there's some other changes later on in the provisions, but it's especially focused, the idea is 100% to land, and we'll come to those next, but it's the overland flow paths, especially in terms of integration. And as I understand that, that's because once you've got water flowing overland, it needs to connect, or it's not going to work. So the integration there, are you seeing it for all systems, or just especially the overland flow, which is the risk of running into Lake Hayes? I'm just interested whether it's that sort of, you'd like the whole system integrated or more just a component of it.
So, in the sense, sorry, when you asked that question, Commissioner, in the sense of integration that all water should join up, is it?
Yes, I'm just interested in terms of, we've talked about integrated stormwater systems and whether they should be sort of collective and putting things to land. And there's a whole discussion about that part and whether the landowners need to work together. There's, to my mind, a separate discussion, which is when it can't go to land in that 1% or off Slope Hill if it's just not possible. That, to my mind, is is that, from your point of view, the more important one to have integrated, rather than if each landowner can do 100% to land on their land for the normal, then that's good, but it still leaves the Slope Hill or the 1% issue. And is that really the integration?
I think they're both equally important. Yeah, but I think and both. I mean, I think the provisions in terms of the subdivision matter of discretion and assessment, I think we're split to consider the two separately, and but I think they're both equally important. And I think, but it is the latter, the Slope Hill runoff and then overland flow that is, I think, going to be the tougher nut to crack, particularly as different blocks of land are developed separately, and I wish now that I had the opportunity to listen to the questioning of the stormwater experts, because I know Mr. Gardner, I think, made reference to stormwater management guidelines that might sit outside the plan, and I'd imagine that would be how we would address the management of this type of situation. But I guess that's a question in my mind, as it is, I'm sure, in your mind, as to what that looks like.
Mr. Chair, may I add a piece on that?
Yes, absolutely.
If there was no impact from stormwater, mana whenua would still be here having this kōrero. And I think that's an important piece to note, is this isn't about stormwater in particular, it's about how everything is connecting, and the blue-green network will help us achieve that. But this isn't, we're not here just to try and push stormwater to the side, because it's going to take all the community that are living in there plus the council to get this right, if that helps answer that. And that when we're talking about an integrated approach, it's not, this is more valuable than this area. It's about, as regional council, QLDC, mana whenua, working together to understand where the integrated strategic priorities are in the catchment. And if we need to, like, where does that actually sit physically? And which areas do we need to be restoring? But right now, we could be in another area on the Awa, and we might need to push 10 kilometres downstream to actually do something. And that's the kōrero that we're trying to have here, is that integrated approach, is how do we set ourselves up for success in this for this particular development, but is that enough? And if it's not, where do we go to next?
And that's part of the challenge that you've laid down, is exactly that. The question to that and the holistic nature is exactly right. You've got to look on the whole catchment. Unfortunately, we have a myopic role just on the variation area. So it's working out what we can do and we need to do in relation to the potential effects and the issues that have been raised. And then, yes, there's going to have to be a lot more discussions. And it's not just with those groups, as you said earlier, with the developers themselves on the variation.
And as a concerned kaitiaki, I just want to understand how we get that right. Like, what is the feedback from the board on what we can be doing on the ground to help make this process run smoother, where the success is shared success genuinely, and that we can do both. We can do both as a community and as like advancing infrastructure in Queenstown. I genuinely want to understand how to get this right. And when we're going through the consenting process, when we're going through public consultation, that we've actually got mechanisms in place to put conditions in place to help understand how we can realise integrated approach throughout the whole process, and genuinely working with mana whenua and council to understand where those priorities are. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. Just carrying on through that policy, the next one's the soakage to ground and the 1% AEP, and just sticking with the idea of improvement, which others have talked about in terms of what the council said. My understanding is that the current standard in the district is the 1 in 20, so that's a step change up in terms of stormwater requirement. So again, it reinforces what I think Mr. Munro was talking about there are things here that are improvements over what is standard within the district.
Yes, and I think that's a positive part of the journey that these provisions have travelled on, because I think there was a bit of wriggle room in the earlier version of them for a 1%, and you can't achieve that at 5%, so it's heartening to see that. Then
the only other part, and it's one that we'll have to ponder, but you may have wording that comes to mind, not right now, Mr. Bathgate, but maybe overnight or tomorrow, is with that policy and the discussion about enhancement or more ambitious, is if you could just, and it's up to you and your client whether they want you to do it, but it would definitely be useful for us if you could potentially give some comment on the drafting of that new provision, please, because that way we're not trying to guess what you and Kaitahu may be after. We can see what you say and the council can see it as well.
I'll have a look at that, Mr. Commissioner. Well, I do like the phrasing of avoid adverse effects. It's very strong.
And that came out of discussions we had last week with the stormwater experts. So as a result of that, it's changed.
Right.
And it's changed quite fundamentally to be focused on waiwhakaata, not on engineering type elements. So it may be that you say, look, this is how it's drafted is great and what you're after, or it may be that there's a tweak there in terms of anything in ambition or enhancement linking back to Te Mana o Te Wai and the MPS. But
thank you, yes.
Other than that, I've got no additional comments. Thank you. I was about to say Hoani may now have some more questions, and he does.
I think I have one, and it may or may not be related to Pūtahi. I know a little bit about the ORC's Land and Water Regional Plan and the development of their FMUs and the catchment-based approach, but only for this catchment through the evidence that's provided in relation to here. We had been exploring last week with the stormwater experts the aspiration for a minimum of designing to the 1 AEP, knowing that there could be a 0.5, so a 1 in 200 year event. And through that discussion, so if we look at the 1 in 100 year event with it designed up to that, first flush will probably end up being treated in some manner because it's designed to take that, and then the ongoing flow will likely ending up in the lake. There was the point of reanimation of contaminants and sediments that was brought up through that discussion once that event goes on and on and on and on. And whether there's some way of minimising that reanimation or other ways of dealing with that from a downstream or in-stream perspective of that overland flow before it gets to the lake.
The ways that we can solve sediment in this country today are different to how we're going to solve the issues of sediment in 50 years' time. And we need to be innovative in how we accomplish this. And we have many different types of tools in order to achieve it, both naturally and with the installation of infrastructure. And part of that is the story of the catchment, and it's bringing all those groups together to actually look abroad. We must look abroad to how to solve these sediment issues. We need to go look at the other Great Lakes around the world to how they've solved a eutrophic state of stagnant water bodies, like over in Norway and Sweden, where they've actually brought lakes back from a eutrophic state to being drinkable. This catchment is important because of where we need to get to, but also as a small country like Aotearoa and how we impact climate change at scale. We do it front and centre in Queenstown. That's a part of the challenge. How we build these developments will be seen on the world stage, impacting our natural, outstanding landscape. So part of that corridor there is very important. We don't have all the tools here to do it currently, but we do have some mechanisms to help filtrate those nutrients out. But we need to look further, and then that's going to take more minds around the table to handle that type of fluid and sediment. Yeah. And there are pilots occurring in the catchment currently to do that. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing there is Mātauranga isn't stagnant and its new challenges are happening as you go forward. Mātauranga can be
absolutely
modified, adapted, bring in other technologies into it to ensure the outcomes for the wide. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mātauranga Māori is live and well within the catchment. And with the support from the Otago Regional Council to get our letter of expectation documents developed by Tammy and Ōkaha, that's a vital first step in making sure that we've got some foundational documents within the catchment to start creating some of these new baselines when we still have good documentation of the old baselines and what those Mahinga Kai values were. So as that develops, we will develop.
And where do you see those documents sitting in relation to the Te Pūtahi Ladies Mile plan change?
They're documents to be used by mana whenua in consultation with Ōkaha and Te Ao Marama, and they're fantastic guiding pieces of information to help keep us safe as we develop those narratives within the community.
Good, kia ora.
Kia ora.
Any other questions from the panel?
No, thanks.
No? Well, thank you both very much, and thank you for not just the submissions and evidence, but for the time today and answering the questions. And just that one potential piece of homework, if you'd like to, just to help with that policy, and if there's any additional comments. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the afternoon. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
So we'll adjourn now for lunch and we'll start again at 1:30. So we'll see everyone back here at 1:30.